Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan. On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Convergence.fm. On today's episode, I'm going to share a case study from another product success lab that our team facilitated. The company that we were working with had hundreds of employees, and they operated in a more traditional non-technology type industry. And it's an organization where insurance companies, medical providers, and regulation overlap. So you can imagine it's a really tough space with fast changing rules, pretty high stakes, and also a lot of repeatable, knowledge heavy work. Something I loved about this company is that from really early on, they've been quite proactive. They didn't wait for a crisis to ask where technology could help. They thought about this more strategically. And what they did was they took a very simple approach and figured out where about 80% of their revenue comes from and tried to find more efficiencies and new business models there. I like this approach in this case better than really overly sophisticated decision-making frameworks that product managers can sometimes use because it allowed them to go fast in a very accurate way, even though there was some level of imprecision. Execution, though, was another story. They'd spent over 2 years and close to $10 million in software that was meant to automate and streamline that repeatable knowledge work in their core process. The first vendor just didn't deliver a year in, and they fired them, and they brought in a second vendor who was also struggling to get this code into production. This resulted in a lot of start-stop releases and a lot of manual effort still sitting with their staff. The staff also started to wonder if these promised tools would ever show up. So letting this pattern continue would have meant for leadership more of a financial drag, more dollars chasing a product that may never launch or have an ROI. Opportunity cost. Every month of delay meant that employees kept doing work that could be automated and also impact what value they were bringing for their customers. There's, of course, a credibility loss that I kind of mentioned inside the company where confidence in this technology roadmap and the promises from leadership was fading, and the vendors and their internal champions were also taking a reputational hit. This is a tough cycle for any leadership team to face, and we were happy to dig in with them. Instead of doubling down and really focusing just on what wasn't working and being very tactical there, the first thing we did is that we collectively stepped back together. And then we ended up with a new action plan with something that everyone that was there could own and engage in and really de-risk the accountability, I think. The first part of this action plan was a living technology and product roadmap. We ran a leadership workshop and we really fine-tuned the handful of really critical problems that technology could really solve and sequenced that into quarterly objectives and looked at the implications to the various stakeholders and the various customers along the way. Each one was small enough to ship quickly and also measure to see whether the outcome was met or not. And we wrote it in a way that the business stakeholders could understand it well so they could plan strategically around it. And we also tested this writing against the frontline workers and the users of this product. And these are folks that we needed to regain trust with, by the way, and made it so that they knew how their work would start to be impacted and also invited feedback from both groups that was really helpful in refining the roadmap. The second thing we did in a very related way was around incremental delivery. We took this roadmap of quarterly deliverables, took the first quarter from there, and then we distilled it into a product backlog. This had a lot more specifics on the UX, the integrations, the data mapping, and we helped facilitate a conversation between the stakeholders at this company and their technology vendor around expectations of iterative delivery, things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, Things that would ultimately enable our client team to review the working product at least once a week and hopefully more often. We really believe that this is going to be also a very critical forcing function for their vendor to minimize the surprises that have been showing up so far when they had really big, chunky deliverables that they tried to put into production. So it's not clear yet whether the vendor will be able to consistently meet this demand, but so far we're all collectively optimistic based on their level of engagement and willingness to change their process. Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. Why the braids? Maybe they look cute, but really, it's because I'm finally getting a haircut. I'm donating this hair to Crowns of Courage, an incredible group that makes wigs for kids going through cancer. I know how much hair can be such a big part of making someone feel confident and more like themselves. And this is a way that we can help a child feel like that, especially during such a hard time. On top of that, I'm also matching donations to the Children's Foundation here in Michigan. The foundation funds health and wellness programs for kids in underserved communities, and I've gotten to see firsthand how thoughtful and impactful their work is. This is where you folks in my community can help. If you donate, whether it's a 20, 50, whatever feels right, I'm going to match it. So your gift is going to go twice as far. Whether it's because cancer has touched your life or you find meaning in helping kids feel whole again, here's an opportunity to double that impact. Thank you so much for your support here. The third thing that we collectively put together into the action plan was around product ownership internal to the company. The good news is that in order to solve the delivery misses that they'd already been experiencing, they hired a process expert on their internal staff. This was someone who was an expert on Kaizen and Lean. And I think it was a reasonably good decision, especially for someone who's not too familiar with product already. And the intent that they had here was have someone in-house that could be solely responsible for technology road mapping and delivery and holding their vendors accountable to a Gantt chart. While I do think this is a huge step to hire an in-house project manager, we shared with them how they could expand this role and capability from project management into product management, and beyond just managing schedules, but also doing things like setting priorities, tracking business outcomes and not just deliverables, as well as holding vendors accountable in a collaborative way. We refined the language between the stakeholders and this individual as part of this process, reframed success in terms of outcomes and not just Gantt chart or deliverables, and also trained this individual on setting priorities based on business impact and the needle threading sequencing that comes with that. I will say that we got a little lucky here that this person in question was already fairly familiar with software and they'd already played around with building things like Excel macros and scripts and stuff as part of their role. So it was enough, I think, for them to understand things like information architecture and take that skill set to one that could communicate acceptance criteria to the vendors, have critical conversations around priority with their business stakeholders in-house and so forth. So I think it's also beneficial that this person came from a lean manufacturing background. And you've probably figured by now that I have a soft spot for folks who have worked in manufacturing and done lean there, because I think that this experience is a very helpful metaphor to now do lean software and minimize waste in software delivery instead of minimizing waste on the manufacturing shop floor. The fourth thing we did is set up weekly demos. The internal leads were now enabled and empowered to test the feature based on a user story level granularity multiple times a week. So we trained their internal process hire to do the first layer of acceptance testing, as well as do product demos of working integrated productionized product with their internal stakeholders and other leads. And this really helps with catching misunderstandings or under communications very early and communicated back to the delivery team in a time when it's still very cheap and fast to be able to fix versus waiting later when this debt builds up a lot more. The last thing we did was work on vendor governance. We worked on this company's behalf to help negotiate their vendor contracts and how they were set up around the payment milestones they already had. And we rooted in it in the process we just talked about. And essentially, if a vendor couldn't share working software, it would force a highly critical conversation. And this would either tend to lead to reprioritization, more accountability from this delivery vendor, or a pivot on the company's part as a worst case scenario. This wasn't easy to do, and it took obviously some convincing on the vendor. But I think the fact that they were struggling to show production software after 12 months of being paid added enough strain and willingness on their part to come to the table with an open mind and willingness to find a way to fix things. I think both parties here wanted to fix, and having product consultants facilitate a conversation through our presence really helped with sharing some of the risk and accountability across both parties instead of a binary sort of two-sided negotiation that oftentimes takes a long time and contention to end up at a solution. And then an aside is through this process, we uncovered some product experiments to test out viability of some completely new AI products that harnesses decades of institutional knowledge that they had in their organization. Given the regulatory space that they work in, they had many, many years of saved data that they had saved for compliance reasons that we uncovered could be used for building an artificial intelligence model. They weren't sure if it was worth normalizing and cleaning the data and everything. And so what we did was we whittled down this idea that they had and this benefit or the strength that they had in the data into 2 or 3 experiments that they could run 1 week at a time to really help understand things like the level of pain that this solution solves, the technical feasibility and how usable their data was, and also the customer desirability that they could go work with their account team to go test. And ultimately, what we wanted to do here was move things from this analysis paralysis into momentum around decisions so they can very clearly and explicitly decide whether they want to invest in this or ignore it collectively, instead of kind of this nagging distraction on the sidelines that it had become after many, many months of wondering whether they had potential here. Now, what this means for you, I think this experience drove home a lesson that we see time and time again. That strategy only matters if there is execution to back it up, if you can actually ship it. And I think it's also a lot easier to plan and strategize with some level of imprecision, but going faster, if there is trust, transparency, and a sense of control in the delivery engine that is actually going to help execute. So instead of having to nail down all of the details in the strategy, I think you can place bets a lot faster, provided you're testing them quickly, by building and shipping experiments, whether they're high in tech or low in tech. And these early versions and experiments of your product can be used to inform the precision of the strategy. But in the meantime, you're also de-risking some critical things and building momentum. So if you're leading a similar transformation in your company, I would highly recommend doing what this company did in terms of starting with a business impact is the highest, but also finding ways to ship small, usable things in measurable ways so that someone within your company can own the outcomes and also have a visibility and control over whether progress is really being made or not. I think that's how you move from really long, big plans and budgets to true results for your team and ultimately your customers and your market. If you've got a delivery team that's underperforming, or you're in an analysis paralysis about whether or not you should invest in an AI product because you're not sure whether the juice is worth the squeeze, or you're having trouble getting momentum, hit our team up. It's something that we really enjoy doing. Find us on our social media and send us a DM, or head on to our website, convergence.fm/contact, CONTACT, and leave us a message, and someone from the team will get a hold of you. And we'd love to facilitate a similar product success workshop with yourself and your stakeholders. Hope you enjoyed this case study from a recent product success workshop that we did. We will be back on convergence.fm next week with another episode on fostering engaged teams and shipping delightful and innovative products. We'll see you then. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.